The dominant artistic style of the 17th century was Baroque, a bold, theatrical style characterized by movement, intense emotion, and dramatic contrasts in lighting. Originating in Rome to celebrate the renewed power of the Catholic Church, it spread to Spain, Portugal, Germany, and France, where it also came to represent the grandeur and power of monarchs, notably Louis XIV of France. The Low Countries adopted a more restrained version of the Baroque style, leading to a golden age of Dutch painting dominated by portraits, landscapes, and scenes of everyday life. Early in the 18th century, the Baroque style was superseded by the more light-hearted and ornamental Rococo style associated initially with the court of Louis XV of France. Light, shimmering colors and swirling forms were used with wit and elegance in paintings, sculptures, and dazzling frescoes for palaces and churches. A renewed interest in the art of ancient Greece and Rome and the influence of the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement promoting the power of human reason, led to a rejection of Rococo around the middle of the 18th century in favor of a revived classical style, neoclassicism. Perfectly composed, muted paintings feature noble, heroic scenes from classical literature and history, often with high moral values, and highly accomplished marble sculptures were inspired by the lost art of the ancients. Baroque is the name given to the vigorous style that dominated art and architecture in the 17th century. This style originated in Rome, from where it spread throughout Europe. It flourished mainly in Catholic countries and has strong ties with the Counter-Reformation movement in religion. By the late 16th century, the Mannerist style had become rather lifeless and contrived, with artists placing more emphasis on polish and virtuosity than on genuine feeling. In some ways, the Baroque style looked back to the grandeur, dignity, and directness of the High Renaissance, but it also took elements from Mannerism, notably intense emotion and a sense of movement, blending these influences into a fresh and dynamic style. Origins and influences. This new style was linked with contemporary religious events. From the mid-16th century, the Catholic Church made forceful efforts to assert its authority in the face of the spread of the Protestant Reformation. This fight back is known as the Counter-Reformation. The Church realized the propaganda value of art, and it set official guidelines for artists, encouraging them to create realistic works to which ordinary men and women could relate. However, there is much more to Baroque art than this religious element, and there were other stylistic currents in the 17th century. In France particularly, there was a strong strain of classicism, and in Dutch art, for example, there was often an earthy naturalism. These three currents, Baroque, classicism, and naturalism, often overlap or blend. Subjects. Although religion remained central to art in most countries, other subjects became increasingly important during the 17th century. Portraits were in. The Four Rivers Fountain, Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This powerful and energetic work in the Piazza Navona was created in 1648, and is the most famous of several fountains Bernini created in Rome. Baroque. Timeline. Italian Baroque art is sometimes divided into three main phases: Early Baroque, c. 1600, 25, High Baroque, c. 1625-75, coinciding roughly with the career of Bernini, and Late Baroque, c. 1675 onwards, the style blending imperceptibly with Rococo in the early 18th century. Bernini visited Paris in 1665, and the subsequent rejection of his designs for the Louvre indicated that the balance of artistic power was beginning to shift from Italy to France. Century. 1601, Caravaggio, Supper at Emmaus. 16-06, Montaigne's The Merciful Christ. 1611-14, Rubens, The Descent from the Cross. 1622-25, Bernini, Apollo and Daphne. 1624, Hall's The Laughing Cavalier. Schools. Italy, France, Spain, and Flanders, which at this time was ruled by Spain, were the main Catholic countries where art flourished in the 17th century. Among Protestant countries, the Dutch Republic had by far the most vigorous tradition, particularly in painting, but England also played a significant role in artistic affairs, partly because of the patronage of Charles I, one of the greatest of all royal connoisseurs. Italian. At the beginning of the 17th century, Italy led Europe in the visual arts, just as it had done during the Renaissance. Rome was the main artistic center, and it was there, in the years around 1600, that Caravaggio and Annibale Carracci laid the foundations of the Baroque style in painting. They abandoned the conventions of mannerism, introducing a new gravity but also a new vitality. Sculpture was similarly reinvigorated by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who was the dominant figure in Italian Baroque art, running a large workshop in Rome that was involved in many of the major commissions of the time. Outside Rome, both Bologna and Naples rose to prominence as leading centers of painting, and although Florence had declined in importance, Pietro da Cortona produced some of his finest work there. Foreigners in Rome. Painters and sculptors flocked to Rome from all over Europe, not only to study its unrivaled storehouse of ancient and Renaissance art, but also to seek work. It was a prosperous and growing city, with a steady demand for artists to decorate the many new churches and palaces that were being erected. Some foreign artists settled permanently in Rome, but others returned to their homelands, thereby helping to spread knowledge of the Baroque style. The betrayal of Christ Guercino, the dramatic lighting and vigorous sense of movement are typical of Baroque art. See 1621 oil on canvas, 113.5 x 140 cm, Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, UK. French. During the 17th century, France became the most powerful state in Europe and began to rival Italy for artistic leadership. Whereas in Italy the most characteristic Baroque art was religious, in France it was used in the service of the state, specifically to glorify King Louis XIV. His palace at Versailles is one of the great monuments of the style. The two most illustrious French painters of demand virtually everywhere, landscape, which had begun to emerge as an independent theme in the 16th century, became a speciality for many artists. Mythological and allegorical subjects were popular with sophisticated patrons, and genre, scenes of everyday life, flourished, particularly in the Dutch Republic. Style and techniques. Baroque art in its purest form was produced only in Catholic countries, often as part of the decoration of churches. Rich materials, spectacular altarpieces, and grandiose paintings on walls and ceilings were in keeping with the ritual of Catholic worship. Protestant churches and ceremonies were usually much plainer, and Baroque art generally seemed over-emotional to Protestant eyes. However, elements of the Baroque style often occur in Protestant countries and in secular as well as religious subjects. T. Heswager of Hals's Laughing Cavalier, for example, are historically in the Baroque spirit. The Israelites Gathering Manna, Nicolas Poussin 16339, oil and canvas, 147 by 200 cm, Louvre, Paris, France. The Israelites Gathering Manna, detail. Poussin's style was strongly influenced by the classical dignity of ancient and Renaissance art, but the eloquent gestures he uses here are typically Baroque. Originating. 1618–48. The 30 Years' War, at the end of which Spain's power has greatly declined and France's has increased. 1626. St. Peter's, Rome, consecrated. Its decoration goes on throughout the century. 1652–78. A series of wars with England and later France devastates the Dutch economy, including its art market. 1642. Rembrandt, The Night Watch. 1648. Poussin, The Ashes of Phocion collected by his widow. 1650. Velázquez, Pope Innocent X. 1666–68. Vermeer, The Artist's Studio. C. 1678. Murillo, The Immaculate Conception. The Century, Claude and Nicolas Poussin, worked mainly in Rome, but they were highly influential in France, helping to create an ideal of classical dignity and restraint that had a profound and enduring impact on the country's art. Portrait of the Blessed John Houghton. Francisco de Zurbarán. This painting has an austere naturalism and a classical grandeur, but its emotional directness can be considered Baroque. It shows an English Carthusian monk who was martyred in the reign of Henry VIII. 1637–39, oil on panel, 122 by 64 cm, Museo de Cádiz, Cádiz, Spain. Spanish. Although it declined greatly in political power, Spain had a glorious flowering of art in the 17th century, and the Baroque style was well suited to the religious fervor of the country. Religion dominated its art, although the greatest Spanish artist of the time, Diego Velázquez, was primarily a portraitist. His work sometimes has a rhetorical quality characteristic of Baroque art, but it is always tempered by naturalism. He spent most of his career in Madrid, which was becoming the most important art center in the country, although other cities, notably Seville, were also of major importance at this time. Dutch and Flemish art in Flanders, roughly equivalent to modern-day Belgium, and the Dutch Republic, Holland, shared a common heritage, as the two countries had been united in the 16th century. However, while the Dutch broke away from Spanish rule to create an independent, largely Protestant state, Flanders remained loyal to Spain and to the Catholic Church. Consequently, although there are many similarities between the countries' art, religious subjects remained of major importance in Flanders but were relatively uncommon in Holland. Peter Paul Rubens dominated Flemish art and ranks as one of the archetypal figures of the Baroque style, his work being full of warmth and energy. Rembrandt was a figure of comparable stature in Holland, although his influence was less pervasive, as 17th-century Dutch art was unprecedented for its volume and variety of painters. England had only modest native-born talent in painting and sculpture during the 17th century, and imported most of its best artists. The art-loving Charles attracted both Rubens and Anthony van Dyck to work for him. The latter was chief court painter, as well as numerous lesser lights. His son, Charles II, was much less of a connoisseur, but nevertheless he was a highly cultivated man who employed artists of the caliber of Grinling Gibbons and Peter Lely. Gibbons had English parents, but he was born and brought up in Holland. The outstanding native-born English artist of the period was portraitist William Dobson. Young Woman with a Water Jug, Jan Vermeer. This is an example of the everyday life subjects beloved of Dutch artists, but its strength of composition and wonderful handling of color and light lifted far above the commonplace. C. 1662, Oil on Canvas, 44.5 x 39 cm, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, U.S.